France has ordered hospitals to prepare for war with Russia. Every single hospital across the country has been ordered to prepare for a major conflict expected in 2026. Hospitals are being upgraded, emergency facilities are being reinforced, and doctors are being instructed to prepare for a massive influx of wounded soldiers, not just French troops but also foreign soldiers from NATO allies. By March of 2026, these preparations will be visible everywhere. And experts warn of a bigger conflict than World War I and II. Sounds cold, right? Because it actually is. This force does not intend or aim to wage any wars against Russia, but it is a force that must guarantee peace and send a very clear strategic signal. And not just France, but Britain is secretly rebuilding its military. Norway is restoring the Cold War-era bunkers hidden deep inside of mountains, and countries along Russia's borders are now training their young citizens for a conflict. A war that would be insanely expensive. Russia versus NATO would cost the world over $1.5 trillion. And if the conflict stretches on and on like World War II, the impact would be more catastrophic. So despite being an economic mess, why does Russia want a war with NATO? And most importantly, what would be the consequences of that war? Now, this is going to be a bit of a controversial topic, and I don't care if YouTube doesn't promote it because I'm going to be exposing the truth anyways. Controversial topics are suppressed by the algorithm, except when you, the watcher, force it to promote it by clicking the like button. The Russia-Ukraine conflict began in 2022. Everyone thought Russia played an unexpected move. Turns out somebody had already predicted this move months earlier. The real story started months before the full-scale invasion in 2022. In October of 2021, U.S. intelligence, military, and diplomatic leaders gathered at the White House after months of monitoring Russian troop movements and massive military preparations. They warned that a large-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine was almost certain. Soon, the world began to see the signs. Satellite images, social media posts, and intelligence reports from November and December of 2021 showed tanks, missiles, and heavy weaponry moving towards Ukraine's borders. But the Kremlin stayed silent. By mid-December of 2021, Russia's foreign ministry issued a clear demand. NATO must stop its military activity in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and Ukraine must never be allowed to join NATO. Yes, you heard that right. The Russia-Ukraine conflict was never just about Ukraine, it has always been about NATO. To understand this rivalry, we need to go back in time to the origins of Russia and NATO's long-standing rivalry. You see, World War II ended in 1945, but peace really didn't last that long. By 1948, the Soviet Union refused to withdraw its forces from Eastern Europe and even blockaded Berlin, tightening its grip on the region. In response, the United States and its allies created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO, in 1949. At the time, NATO started with just 12 founding members. The US, Britain, France, Canada, Italy, the Netherlands, Iceland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Norway, Portugal, and Denmark. Its mission was simple: to protect each other from any outside attack. It was a no-brainer for almost every country to join NATO. The reason was NATO's most important article. Under Article 5 of NATO's treaty, if one NATO country is attacked, it is considered an attack on all NATO countries, so it would act as a shield for any country joining NATO. But from the very beginning, Moscow never saw NATO as a defensive alliance, but as America's military power inside Europe, a tool to contain and weaken Moscow. Then came 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed into 15 independent countries: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. With this collapse, Russia's nightmare started to worsen. One after another, many of these former Soviet states started moving closer to NATO because they knew that if they didn't join, Russia would try to acquire them again. In 2004, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, three countries that once belonged to the Soviet Union, officially joined NATO. In 2008, Georgia and Ukraine were offered NATO membership, but they couldn't join back then, partially because of Russia's influence over their governments. Russia wasn't just after Ukraine's land. It wanted to stop NATO's expansion, because if all of Russia's neighboring countries joined NATO, then in any future conflict, the U.S. military would have the legal right to deploy troops directly on Russia's borders. For any Russian president, that would be the biggest humiliation in history. But for Putin, it was something more important: his long-term dream. You see, Putin doesn't want to revive the Soviet Union. He wants to restore the Russian Empire, an empire that once included Ukraine, Poland, Finland, and much of Eastern Europe. Ukraine shares a 1,900 kilometers or about 1,200 m border with Russia, and this acts as a buffer zone, a shield between Russia and the West. That's why in December of 2021, Russia demanded that Ukraine must never join NATO. But the United States and NATO rejected Russia's demands, warning Moscow of severe economic sanctions if it invaded. Then came February of 2022. Satellite images revealed the largest deployment of Russian troops near Belarus since the Cold War, and soon after the world watched in shock as Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In the beginning, Russia may have started the Ukraine war believing that if it threatened the West through military action, Europe and the US would step back and abandon their plans of including Ukraine and NATO. Putin thought that once Ukraine returned to Russia's influence, Moscow can then push further, demanding the withdrawal of other neighboring countries that were once part of the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance signed in 1955 as a countermeasure against NATO's formation. But this strategy backfired. Even after threatening Europe through the Ukraine war, Russia failed to stop NATO's expansion. In April of 2023, Finland officially joined NATO, adding another massive 1,340 kilometers or about 830 m border between Russia and the alliance, a move that completely reshaped the strategic map of Europe. This doubled NATO's direct land border with Russia overnight and completely changed the strategic map of Europe. But the pressures didn't stop there. In March of 2024, Sweden also joined NATO, giving the alliance full control over the Baltic Sea region. Now let's look at the map. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland are already NATO members. With Finland and Sweden on board, the only two neighbors of Russia not in NATO are Belarus and Ukraine. For Russia, this was like a big red flashing light like you see in those movies, right? Warning, warning. This growing encirclement made Putin angry because for him this isn't just about geopolitics, it's personal humiliation. Like every other dictator and authoritarian leader, power means everything to Putin, and according to prospect theory, leaders like him take far bigger risks when they feel like they are losing power, territory, or influence. This is also the reason why, even after 4 years of continuous war, Putin's goal has shifted. It's no longer just about Ukraine. It's no longer just about stopping NATO expansion. Putin wants something far bigger. He wants NATO troops withdrawn from all of Russia's neighboring countries. But there's a problem with that. Russia understands that Ukraine will not surrender, and Europe and the United States will continue supporting Ukraine no matter how long this war lasts. For Putin, this leaves only one path. To win against NATO, he must drag the war on for as long as possible and slowly and steadily capture territories. Because if Russia directly attacks Europe, it cannot survive against NATO. As no matter how big the Russian army is, it simply cannot match NATO's overwhelming numbers, resources, and military strength. And the numbers clearly show that. According to NATO's official data, in 2024, the combined defense spending of all NATO member countries was around 1.45 trillion US. By comparison, Russia's defense budget was only $140 billion, less than 15% of NATO's total spending. And when it comes to manpower, the gap is even bigger. If NATO decides to engage directly in a conflict with Russia, it could deploy over 3.3 million soldiers, including 40,000 elite troops already on high alert ready to move within hours. Russia, on the other hand, has around 1.2 million soldiers in total with only about 800,000 active troops, and even that number has been heavily affected by its losses in Ukraine. Putin knows he cannot win a direct confrontation, at least not yet. That's why Russia is stretching the Ukraine war for as long as possible. It's draining Europe's and America's military strength and economic power while buying time to rebuild Russia's forces and prepare for a bigger conflict. Since the invasion, the United States has committed over $118 billion in assistance to Ukraine, including $65 billion in direct military aid. By early 2023, the Biden administration approved the delivery of increasingly advanced weaponry to Kyiv. From the Patriot air defense system, designed to counter Russian missile strikes, to modern battle tanks capable of changing the dynamics on the ground. And that's not all. The U.S. has significantly boosted its troop presence in Europe, stationing over 100,000 American soldiers across the continent to reinforce NATO's eastern flank and deter Russian aggression. Russia is silently calculating all the funding, military strength, alliances, and resources of the West to find the right time to start a war against Europe. And multiple intelligence agencies have already warned about this possibility. In February of 2025, Denmark's state news agency reported that Russia has already upgraded its military capacity, modernized its weapons, and boosted its defense production to levels not seen since the Cold War. Russia's strategy is clear: more troops, more weapons, and more military power. The Kremlin had already planned to increase its defense spending by 25% in 2025, taking it to an all-time record high of 13.5 trillion rubles. That's about $143 billion. This is 3 trillion rubles more than this year's budget, which is already the highest in Russian history. In 2025, spending on defense and security combined will reach a staggering 41.5 trillion rubles, 40% of Russia's entire government budget. Moscow is moving ahead with plans to expand its forces and form new divisions, not just brigades, positioning many of them close to NATO's borders. One of the biggest developments is the creation of the 44th Army Corps in Karelia, right near the border with Finland, a country that just joined NATO in 2023. In September of 2024, President Vladimir Putin announced plans to expand Russia's armed forces to a total of 2.39 million personnel, including 1.5 million active servicemen. And to hit this target, Moscow needs over 180,000 new recruits, because of which they are hiring youngsters at full speed. Even many young Russians don't want to join. Russia's spring draft of 2025 has called up 160,000 conscripts, 10,000 more than the same period in 2024. To get more men in uniform, Moscow has even raised the maximum draft age from 27 to 30, making millions more eligible for compulsory military service. And this time the process is different. Notices are not just being sent by mail, but also digitally through the Goslugi government portal. To avoid army recruitment, many young Russians are trying to avoid military service by applying for alternative civilian services. But according to a human rights lawyer, Timo Poskin, every new draft has become a lottery, with authorities constantly finding new ways to get more soldiers in the army. And it doesn't stop there. Apart from the twice-yearly conscription, Russia is also recruiting contract soldiers and even thousands of fighters from North Korea to strengthen its ranks. According to reports, over 100,000 Russian soldiers have been confirmed killed, and experts believe the real number could be more than double. But despite these losses, Putin has increased the size of the Russian military 3 times since launching the Ukraine invasion in February of 2022. And even as the war in Ukraine continues, Russia is strengthening its position in the Nordic-Baltic region. This gives Moscow a potential first-mover advantage in any future conflict, even if many of its new units are still under strength. But that's not all. Russia maintains powerful air defense systems, electronic warfare units, and advanced military exercises around the Baltic Sea, and its gray zone activities like cyber attacks, intelligence operations, and small-scale provocations are increasing every passing day. Now here's the part that worries NATO. According to the IISS analysis, Russia has already replenished much of its equipment losses from Ukraine. Its ground forces have adapted, reorganized, and could fully recover to pre-202 strength by 2026 or 2027. And Moscow isn't stopping there. It's expected to fully equip its expanded army by 2030 to 2035 if production continues at its current pace. Even though Russia's Black Sea Fleet has suffered heavy losses, its Baltic Fleet and Northern Fleet remain largely untouched. And how can you forget Russia's Northern Fleet operates its most advanced strategic missile submarines, including the Yasanim-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarines. These are supported by Gorskov-class frigates armed with Caliber land attack cruise missiles capable of long-range deep strikes anywhere in Europe. In the Baltic Sea, Russia's naval forces remain a serious threat. They can deploy missile-armed patrol craft, naval mines, and even amphibious assaults on strategic islands and key infrastructure. All part of a larger anti-access and area denial strategy designed to push NATO back and control critical sea routes. But here's what's more alarming. Social spending money for healthcare, education, and welfare is being cut by 16%, dropping from 7.7 trillion rubles to just 6.5 trillion. It's a clear sign that Russia is diverting its entire economy towards war. Putin is betting on the defense industry to boost Russia's long-term power. All of these seem like a huge threat, except the real ones actually got exposed in 2024. In November of 2024, satellite images revealed something shocking. Massive construction activity at 5 top-secret sites linked to the production of solid propellants, the fuel behind Russia's most powerful missile systems. For the last 30 years, there was little evidence of any such expansion, but suddenly since 2023, Russia has started pouring billions into reviving old Soviet-era missile facilities and building brand new infrastructure. But why is this a huge threat? Because solid propellant missile systems are at the heart of Russia's strategic arsenal. These aren't just ordinary rockets. They power short-range ballistic missiles like the 9K-720 Iskander-M used extensively in Ukraine to destroy military targets and critical infrastructure. They also fuel Russia's Tornado's S multiple rocket launchers, its S-300 and S-400 missile systems, which can shoot down enemy aircraft and even be used for ground attacks. But that's not all. These same composite solid propellant motors are used in Russia's intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the backbone of Moscow's nuclear strike capability. And the West's biggest concern isn't just Russia, it's the new axis of power Moscow is secretly building to fight against the US and NATO in a potential World War II. At the core of this new alliance are China, Iran, and North Korea, three nations that are already helping Russia from behind the scenes. But in the future, they could step directly into the battlefield. It's something Zine Brzezinski, the former U.S. National Security Advisor, warned about 30 years ago. He said the greatest threat to U.S. global dominance would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran, united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances. It would be reminiscent of the Sino-Soviet bloc. But this time, China would likely be the leader and Russia the follower. And today, that warning has become reality. This isn't just speculation. In February of 2022, just days before launching its full-scale invasion of Ukraine and sending 10,000 troops into combat, Russia and China signed a historic declaration, a no-limits partnership. Even though Beijing and Moscow have had border disputes in the past, they've set aside their differences to unite against a common enemy, the West. Since then, China and Russia have deepened their cooperation on economics, military strategy, and even nuclear energy. China continues to supply Russia with critical technologies and tritium-enriched uranium to support Moscow's nuclear programs. In November of 2022 and again in July of 2023, President Xi Jinping did warn Putin not to use nuclear weapons, but Beijing hasn't reduced its assistance in any way. And it's not just China. Iran has also joined hands with Moscow, supplying combat drones, missiles, UAVs, and military intelligence from the very first days of the war. Meanwhile, North Korea, isolated from the world because of its brutal dictatorship, is shipping millions of artillery shells to Russia and even negotiating to send manpower to support Moscow's military operations. Beyond these three primary allies, Russia is also using its oil and gas power to buy influence and secure financial backing from countries worldwide. All of this frees up Moscow's resources and allows Putin to focus entirely on preparing for a future conflict, not just against Ukraine, but possibly against NATO itself. Denmark's intelligence says there are no immediate threats of a regular military attack on Denmark itself. While this news was good, other news followed, but this time, not good news. The Defense Intelligence Service warned that Moscow's ambitions go far beyond Ukraine. Russia's 2022 maritime doctrine shows it wants full control over the Arctic region, possibly even up to the North Pole, because these territories are strategically linked to U.S. military operations in the North Atlantic. But there's another reason that makes them even more important. Beneath the ice and rock of Greenland lies huge reserves of rare earth mineral materials that are critical for advanced weapons, semiconductors, electric vehicles, and next-generation technology. Denmark's intelligence believes Russia would be less willing to provoke a direct conflict with the United States over these territories, but far more willing to challenge European NATO countries like Poland, Norway, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Western intelligence agencies tracking this war for the last 4 years are certain that once the Ukraine war ends within the first few months or under a year, Russia could start a new war against Poland, Finland, or Norway to directly challenge NATO. And according to a Bloomberg report, if a Russia-NATO war happens, it could cost the world over $1.5 trillion in the first year alone. The Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would be among the hardest hit, facing massive destruction and huge human losses. Even major European economies could slow down drastically or suffer severe long-term damage, plunging the continent into a deep economic and humanitarian crisis. But the reality is, there's no escape route. Whether Europe wants it or not, if Russia attacks, NATO will have to fight, and that's why Europe must start preparing now, and it already has. In June of 2025, NATO members committed to investing 5% of their GDP annually on core defense requirements and security-related spending by 2035, making one of the biggest military buildups in modern history. But if NATO raises the goal to 5% of GDP by 2035, it would require almost $2.7 trillion more, taking NATO's total annual military spending to an unprecedented 4.2 trillion USD. Looking at individual countries, Germany would need to spend $329 billion annually, France around $221 billion, and Italy nearly $158 billion. To put this into perspective, these figures are higher than their current public spending on education, which stands at $283 billion for Germany, $225 billion for France, and $126 billion for Italy. For context, in 2024, only 9 countries in the world spent 5% or more of their GDP on defense. And most of them were prostates, dictatorships, or war-torn nations where governments can boost military spending without parliamentary approval. But for democracies like the European countries, passing such huge defense budgets is not easy. Firstly, different NATO members face different security environments and strategic priorities, meaning their defense needs don't perfectly align with NATO's collective capability targets. Secondly, even though NATO sets these massive spending goals, funding still comes from individual countries' budgets, which must be approved by the national parliament. But with the threat at Europe's gates, even if it's only a possibility today, the continent knows it must fully prepare for the worst-case scenario. That's why European nations are taking extraordinary measures, from preparing emergency hospital wards and deploying additional troops to training civilians for potential wartime situations. Across the continent, countries are bringing back conscription, expanding reservist forces, and preparing their populations for a possible direct conflict with Russia. Germany, for example, is Europe's largest economy. Back in 2011, Germany abolished compulsory military service. But now, everything is changing. Starting July 1, 2027, Germany will introduce a new military service. Every young man will be required to complete a mandatory digital questionnaire to assess health, location, and combat readiness. For now, military service isn't compulsory, but this system gives the German government the legal power to activate conscription if the security situation worsens, or if there aren't enough volunteers. And Germany is not alone. France is doubling its reservist forces from 46,000 currently to 105,000 by 2035. That's one reservist for every active soldier ready to reinforce the regular army at a moment's notice. Germany's eastern neighbor Poland abolished conscription in 2008. But since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it has launched one of Europe's biggest military buildups. Poland plans to expand its army to 300,000 soldiers by 2035, including 50,000 territorial defense forces, a home guard of part-time soldiers trained to defend local communities. Even Poland has introduced military education in schools. Children as young as 14 are learning state security, disaster response, first aid, and even how to handle firearms. Then there's Finland, a country that never abolished conscription. All Finnish men over 18 must serve 6 to 12 months in the military. Women can volunteer, and around 2/3 of every eligible group completes military training. The result? With a population of just 5.6 million, Finland can mobilize 280,000 soldiers almost instantly. With a total reserve force of 900,000 trained personnel, even Sweden joining NATO has tightened NATO's grip on the Baltic Sea. The preparations for a full-blown war are being carried at insane levels. Here, Norway is reinstating a requirement for all new buildings above a certain size to include bomb shelters, a practice that had halted back in 1998. Additionally, Cold War-era military bunkers inside hidden mountains, which have been deactivated for over 40 years now, are being reportedly restored for service. Meanwhile, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all bordering countries, also announced that they are withdrawing from the Ottawa Convention, which bans anti-personnel landmines. These countries plan to start stockpiling and deploying landmines once again, arguing that it is paramount to give their troops flexibility and freedom of choice in defending NATO's eastern flank. In March of 2025, the European Union announced that Europe must enhance stockpiling of critical equipment and urge the public to maintain sufficient supplies for at least 72 hours in case of emergencies. The EU Commission, in its new EU Preparedness Union strategy, warned that the bloc must prepare for natural disasters, cyber attacks, and geopolitical crises, including the possibility of armed aggression against EU countries. While officially framed as a response to multiple risks, the advisory was widely seen as an indirect message urging Europeans to prepare for potential wartime emergencies. Then in August of 2025, French outlet L'An revealed a leaked letter from Health Minister Catherine Vautrin ordering hospitals to prepare for treating both French and foreign wounded soldiers. According to the documents, France is preparing to become a hub for battlefield casualties, tasked with absorbing hundreds of injured soldiers from its own forces as well as NATO allies. And according to these reports, if Russia is not stopped now, a major war could break out as early as March of 2026. That is why the French government is on high alert. The French Ministry of Health confirmed the plan, stating it was designed to anticipate, prepare, and respond to the health needs of the population while integrating the specific needs of defense. Officials warned about the risk of a huge influx of foreign victims, admitting that civilian hospitals must prepare to treat military patients in large numbers. While Paris framed this move as a major engagement, the reality is far more serious. Under NATO's Article 5, if France or any NATO ally were attacked, the entire alliance would be obligated to respond. That would pull in Britain, the US, and much of Europe, turning a regional conflict into a potential war scenario. Europe's sense of urgency has also intensified because of these Zabad 2025 military drills scheduled between the 12th and 16th of September of 2025 involving Russia and Belarus. The exercises will take place in Belarus, right next to NATO member states Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, escalating fears of provocative maneuvers along NATO's eastern flank. As a result, Europe and the US are also strengthening ties with Japan and the broader Indo-Pacific region to counter potential coordination between Russia and China. In February of 2025, Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force conducted its first-ever joint aircraft carrier exercise with the US Navy and the French Navy in waters east of the Philippines. The 11-day drills involved 11 vessels, including Japan's aircraft carrier Kaga, the American aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson, and the French carrier Charles de Gaulle. Remarkably, this marked the first deployment of France's carrier fleet to the Pacific since the 1960s. War is obviously not Europe's first motive, which is why European nations, the US and the UN, have spent years trying to prevent further escalation. They attempted to stop the Russia-Ukraine war through economic sanctions, cutting trade ties, and diplomatic negotiations, but nothing has worked so far. On February 12, 2025, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin held a 90-minute formal telephone conversation aimed at launching peace negotiations. They followed up with additional calls in March and May of 2025, trying to find common ground. Shortly after, on February 18, 2025, senior US and Russian officials met in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia to discuss the Ukraine conflict, restoring diplomatic ties and exploring economic and investment cooperation. But again, no agreement was reached. In August of 2025, US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin met in Anchorage, Alaska, in what was seen as the last major attempt to de-escalate tensions. However, this meeting has also failed. Just a few days later, Russia launched another wave of attacks in Ukraine, signaling Moscow's determination to continue the war. Despite repeated failures, European nations, the UN, and the US are still searching for diplomatic solutions to end the Ukraine war and prevent Russia from attacking NATO or European countries in the future. But at the same time, Europe cannot rely on negotiations alone, which is why the EU nations are massively boosting their defenses, stockpiling critical resources, and preparing both their militaries and civilians for worst-case scenarios. Whether it is a war or hopefully peace is something only time can tell.